Woodcraft, helping you make woodwork.
That cross-linking that we were talking about. And please don't ask me what the definition of cross-linking is and how that works, because I'm not a chemist and I wouldn't even begin to try to explain that. But it causes it to become harder and more resistant to things like water and chemicals and abrasion and those things. But that's what the pre-cat means. You can buy products that are not catalyzed in any way, and you can buy a catalyst that you can add to them to make it cross-link and become even more durable than it would be to begin with. Okay? A lot of us, though, to be honest with you, a lot of us amateur woodworkers, pardon the expression, I'm sure some of you are much better woodworkers than I am, but for most hobbyist woodworkers, we don't really necessarily need that type of finish, although it is nice that we can buy it, but most of us probably don't really need that kind of durability. You know, if you're putting down a brand new hardwood floor, yeah, you may want this kind of thing. Ed, with your trim and windows and flooring jobs and things like you do, yeah, you probably need these types of finishes. But for most of us that are building furniture and, you know, jewelry boxes and clocks and things of that nature, probably don't really need to go quite that far. Okay? All right.
Any of these raise the grain?
Any water-based product will create a little bit of grain raising. That's a really good question. Did everybody hear that question? Will it raise the grain? Yes, it can cause grain raising.
Just the first time? The first coat?
Usually just the first coat. The best way to treat that, though, or to handle that, take a little spray bottle with some clean water in it and just spritz the surface of the wood. Let it dry for an hour or so. Knock the fuzz down with some 220 grit sandpaper, very gently. You don't want to really sand the wood again. You just want to knock the fuzz down, clean the surface off, put your water-based stuff on, and chances are you're not going to get any, or at least very little, grain raising at that point.
Isn't it true that you should always use the distilled water?
You know, that's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, what the gentleman mentions is a really good idea. Some woods can react with the minerals that they add to tap water. Oak, for instance, has a lot of tannin in it that can react with some of the minerals in tap water and cause really dark black stains on the wood. You really can't do much to get rid of that. So yes, that is a very good idea. Distilled water is your best bet.
Depends on where your water comes from. It could have all kinds of stuff.
It certainly could. You're absolutely right. Same thing with mixing water with dyes. For instance, your trans-tint dye can be mixed straight into water. I would use distilled water for that as well. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a very good point. Any other questions? Comments? Yes, Ron.
Question I have. I use the Armor Seal because it's oil-based, because it tends to bring out the color of the grain when I do some turning. And I haven't sensed the same degree of brilliance from water-based toppings that I use, but the oil-based. Am I correct, or is that? You
are correct, yes. In general, oil-based finishes will, the phrase I like is pop the grain better than water-based will. However, I think if you were to try some of the other water-based products that have that higher urethane content, I think you would find that they are maybe not quite equal to the oil-based as far as popping the grain goes, but they get pretty close. So yeah, especially the water-based wood turners finish, because of the high urethane content, it has a tendency to pop the grain. Those oil-based finishes tend to, and they have to soak deeply into the wood in order to help accentuate that grain. Okay, so don't sand to too high a grit. Okay, 220, 320. That's really, for most projects, that's really about as far as you need to go. Okay. because once you get much past that, then you begin to burnish the surface of the wood. You close off any of the grain and the pores and so forth, and there's just no place for the finish to go, especially a stain. Okay, especially a stain. If you burnish the wood, you're going to have a very difficult time staining it and getting it to look right. Yeah. You had another question, sir?
Yeah, mine probably pertains to either side of the table, but I'm under the impression that if you want to come up with a satin finish, you don't want a glaze or a bright finish on it. If you use multiple coats, if you use a satin finish to begin with, it tends to get a little duller, a little duller, a little duller as you build up. I've read, you can just, maybe you can put this all to bed for me, but I've read that you're supposed to use a gloss finish for everything except the last coat, and then put your satin finish on top of that. It makes it clearer down through the finish.
You know, it's just like any other question when it comes to woodworkers or woodworking. You can ask 6 different woodworkers and get 10 different answers.
Yeah, go on the internet. You can
exactly, exactly. What I can tell you is that this particular finish here, gloss finish, okay, the formula that's in this can is exactly the same as what's in the flat. The difference being, so all of the different sheens of finishes start as gloss. Okay, they then begin to add little flakes of metal that are referred to as flatteners. Okay, so semi-gloss has flatteners in it, satin has even more flatteners in it, and flat will have even more than that. And so if you look at the instructions on your can where it says stir occasionally during use, the reason they have you do that is because those solid metal flakes will settle to the bottom of the can. And so you're in the middle of a project and you dip in your brush and you start putting it on and you're like, wait a minute, that's not satin, that's glossy. Why is that so shiny? It's so shiny because those flatteners have settled out. So it all starts out as gloss. The question that you have, in my opinion, and in the projects that I have done, first of all, I typically stick with the semi-gloss finish. That's what I prefer, okay? But if I want a satin finish, I will usually use a satin finish, a satin sheen finish. Unless you're doing, 5, 6, 7 coats of finish and then trying to buff it or polish it with rotten stone and pumice and all that kind of thing.
I think what they were getting at is my finishing history goes back into lacquers.
Sure, okay.
Okay, when you put a lacquer on, you put one coat of lacquer on, you come back later and you put another on. Well, the second coat or the subsequent coats loosens the first coat, so they become one.
That's correct. Same thing with shellac.
Where with these finishes, that doesn't happen.
That's correct.
So if you put down a layer of that foggy stuff that's going to make this satin, when you put another layer on, you're merely adding another layer of that dulling, whatever you want to call this thing. So it would tend to me, in my mind, the more screens you put, the darker or less.
And that's probably exactly what they're talking about. They're saying that if you want a satin sheen, but you want a very clear finish, to use a gloss for your first coat and then work from there to your satin. And that would make a certain amount of sense. Sheen is not only a result of the finish that you use, okay? It's also created in part, at least, by the reflection of light back out of the finish. And that's what the flatteners do. They interfere with that reflection of light, okay? And so it looks less shiny because you're not getting that real reflection back out.
Yeah, well, that makes sense because those finishes don't blend to make one total coat. It makes you get one.
You get one. You get layers. Yes.
You get layers.
Yes, you do indeed.
It all becoming one.
Yeah.
So it made sense to me.
It does make sense. Yeah, and I think
And you're supposed to be the all-knowing one, so you
I'll reserve comment on that. And you're right, it does make a certain amount of sense. And I think the best thing that a person can do is experiment in their own shop and see what works the best for them. Because like I said, you could ask 6 different woodworkers about that same exact question and you'll probably get 10 different answers. And so the best thing you can do, and I will agree with what that author wrote, that does make a certain amount of sense if you're looking for that very clear, deep looking finish. That would make a certain amount of sense, yes, to do that. If you're looking for a true satin finish, then we may have to part ways on that particular method. But again, it all depends on the final look that you're going for.
The way I look at it, if at that point it's still adjustable. If you don't like the satin that's there, put another coat on.
Sure.
Put another layer that.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah.
You call it.
Because there's no real maximum number of coats that you can put on. You know, I suppose that if you got into the 10 and 15 and 20 coats, that might be a little extreme. Then you could be faced with brittleness and cracking and that kind of thing. But 3-4 coats, certainly I would think by the time you got to 3 or 4 coats, you'd have the look that you were after. Yeah. Anything else?
Thank you.
Okay, well gentlemen, that's all I have for you. Thanks for coming out today. Appreciate it. And if you have any questions, hang around. We'll try to answer them for you.